מסכת בבא בתרא, דף סט, נו משנה, המוכר את השדה, מכר את האבנים שהם לסורקה. If I sell you a field and I don't specify anything else, then that includes the field and it also includes the following items. Stones that are used for the field. The Gemara will talk about what they are used for, but they're necessary for the functioning of the field, and therefore, even though technically they're movable, but they are part of the field. Or if it's a vineyard, then the reeds that are used for the vineyard, as the Gemara will explain, these are reeds that are used to hold up the vines. So again, even though those are technically movable, but they are used exclusively and are necessary for the functioning of the vineyard. And any produce that is connected to the ground. I sell you a field and there's wheat connected to the ground. That's part of the field. It's all connected to the ground. And a thicket of reeds that is of a size that's less than the amount of land that you would sow a quarter kav of seed. As the continuation will say, if it's bigger than that, then it's important in and of itself. It's not considered just part of the field, but rather as its own section. These thickets might be used for a boundary marker. So if it's relatively small, then that's just part of the field. If it's going to be bigger than that, then it's an independent entity. A watch station that is not plastered with clay. If it's just it's like a little hut made out of wood or whatever, so it's not significant in and of itself, and therefore it's considered part of the land. A carob tree that's not grafted. The way that they would plant carob trees is that they would have a wild carob tree. It explains it all here, because that's stronger. And then once that was grown to a certain amount, they would take a cultivated carob tree branch and graft it on. And that would then produce both the strongest tree and the best fruit, that combination. However, it has to be at a certain stage in order for that to happen. So if it's before that stage, then this carob tree is not yet considered very important, and therefore it's just part of the land when it's sold with the land. After that stage, it has its own name, its own significance, and is not included in the sale. And also a sycamore tree, while it's growing, they let it grow nice and strong, and then at some point, once it's strong enough, then they start trimming it and using the wood. So if it's already big and strong and they're trimming it and using it, then it's its own entity. It's not included in the sale of the field. But before that, it's called betulat hashikma, still untrimmed. Then, since it's such a small tree and not significant in and of itself, therefore it is included in the sale. Aval lo machar lo et avanim shenan lesorka. Now we're going to see the flip side of everything that we saw in the Resha. If there are stones that are not used for the field, they're not for the benefit of the field, then these are called movable items, not part of the sale of the field. And if it's a vineyard, then these reeds that are not used for the vineyard, they just happen to be reeds there, are not included in the sale. And any grain that's disconnected, it's cut from the ground. Even if it's lying on the ground, they would leave the grain on the ground to dry for a while. That's not considered part of the field and is not sold. However, if I say I'm selling you a field and everything that's in it, then these three items that we just mentioned will be included because I said everything that's in it. So then that would include the stones and the reeds and the cut grain. Ben kach uben kach lo machar lo et chisat hakanim shehi bet roba. But the next set of things, even if you say the field and everything in it, nevertheless, these things are not even included in that, unless you specify specifically, I'm selling you these things. And so that would be the area, the cluster of reeds, that is a bet rova. That's considered an area in and of itself. So if you say the field and everything in it, this area is not in it because it's its own separate entity. ולא את השומרה שהיא עשויה בתית, ולא את החרוב המורכב, ולא את הסדן, ולא את סדן השקמה. And also not the guard tower that's made out of clay. That's if it's made out of plaster and clay, then that's its own entity and not included in the sale. And also a carob tree that's already grafted, or a sycamore tree that is already cut. That sycamore tree, that's it. It's already big, and you're cutting it and using it, so it's already called its own entity, and therefore is not included in the sale, even if you say everything that's in it. These are these minor items that are in it, but these major items that have their own significance are not included, not even in that sale. Now we're going to go through all these different examples and explain them further. Mai avanim shehen lesorka. What does it mean to say stones that are for the use of the field? What kind of use? We'll see two opinions. In Bavel, they say, these are stones that you'd put on the sheaves, the sheaves of grain that you don't want them to fly away. So you take these nice flat stones and put them on top, kind of as paper weights. Ula amar avanim asidurot lagader. Ula has a different opinion. Says these are stones that are arranged for building a fence. You're planning to build a fence, and so you put stones and arrange them ready so that you will build the fence with them, even though they're not yet part of the fence. A question on Ola. We have a baraita from that Rabbi Chia taught that we're talking about stones that are piled up, and he said arranged. So which one is it? And he says, oh, you're right. Okay, change the language of the baraita to be arranged, not just piled up, but they have to be arranged in order for the use of the building of the fence. Now let's go back to these two opinions. According so we said over here in Bavel that we're using these as paperweights, as sheaf weights, to put these stones on the sheaf. That's how they're useful for the field. According to the Bimeir, as long as they are prepared, even though they're not actually placed on the sheaves, as long as they're prepared for it, then they are included in the sale. That's good enough. The Bimeir has a more open definition, but Rabbanan have a stricter definition, and they say no, these stones have to actually be placed on the sheaves. Otherwise, they're just stones, even if they're ready that you're going to use them one day, but right, they have to be actually being used. We're going to see that there's a machloket between the Bimeir and Rabbanan, a whole series of items, and each time the Bimeir will have a more general definition, and Rabbanan a stricter definition. So according to Ula, that says these are stones that are arranged to be used for a fence. According to the Bimeir, as long as they're ready to be used for a fence, even though they're not actually arranged for that purpose, they're just prepared for that, then they're included. Rabbanan says no, they have to actually be arranged for building a fence. Again, a stricter definition. Kanim, my abidataihu. We're talking about a vineyard, so reeds that are needed for the vineyard are included in the sale. What do they do, these reeds? These are reeds that are split on the top, and you place the vines on them. You don't want the vines to just go on the floor because that will ruin the grapes. And so these are reeds that you are prepared on top to hold the vine in place above the ground. According to the Bimeir again, as long as they are smoothed out, shaped on top, even if they're not actually set in place, then that's good enough, and they're included in the sale. According to Rabbanan, they have to actually be set in place in order for them to be included in the sale. Grain that's attached to the ground. You might say, well, that's kind of obvious. It's attached to the ground. So the Gemara says it's a chidush, even though that its time has come for it to be cut down. It's almost ready. It's in the ground now, attached to the ground ground now, but tomorrow we're going to cut it down. Nevertheless, right now it's in the ground, it's attached to the ground, it's included in the sale. ותחיסת הקנים שפחותה מבית רובע ואף דאלימה. And if you have a section of reeds that is in a space less than a bet rova, then that's included in sale, because that's a small area. And the chidush of that is that even if the reeds are very thick, and so they seem to be very significant in and of themselves. No, but we look at the area. Bet less than a bet rova, then that's simply part of the field and is sold along with the field. And a watchtower that is not plastered with clay, that is included in the sale, even if it's not fixed to the ground, in which case you might say, well, it's kind of a movable item. You could pick up this little hut and move it somewhere else. Nevertheless, we consider it it's necessary for the usage of the field, and it's not significant in and of itself, and therefore it's part of the field. And we said a carob tree before the stage at which you would graft it, or a sycamore tree before the stage at which you would cut pieces off of it to use. Those are young trees and therefore don't have their own identity and are part of the sale. And the chidush here is that even though they are nice and big and thick, it could be it's strong already, but you didn't yet officially graft it or cut it down, so that's considered not significant yet and is part of the sale. Next category, now we're going to see the machlokot between Rabbi Meir and Rabbanan, but from the other way around. So if I sell you a field and I don't say anything else, and that there are stones there that are not used for the purpose of the field, they're just regular stones there, so those are not part of the sale. According to the Bimeir, that means if they're not ready for use at all, right? They're stones that are sitting there. In order to make them ready for use, you might have to shape them in a certain way, prepare them in a certain way. So if they're not prepared for use of building a fence or being used as weights, then they're not included. According to Rabbanan, maybe even if they are prepared for use, but you're not actually using them, they're not actually placed on the sheaves, if you're using them as weights, that even though they're prepared for it, but they're not actually on it, they're not included in the sale. And according to Ulau says, that these are stones that you would use, and so in this case you're not using them for a fence, so according to Bimeir, that means they're not prepared for use at all, then they're not included in the sale. But if they're prepared for use, even though they're not actually arranged, then they would be included. According to Rabbanan, even if you prepared them for use, but they're not arranged, they're not included in the sale. ולא את הקנים שבכרם שאינן לסורכו, לרבי מאיר דלה משפיין, רבנן דלה מוקמן. And if it's a vineyard, then these reeds that are not needed for the vineyard are not included. According to the Bimeir, that would mean that they are not smoothed out and shaped in order to be used, so they're not prepared at all. Those are the ones that are not included. But if they're shaped, even if they're not actually being used, they are included. According to the Banan, even if you shape them, but they're not fixed in their place, then that's called not yet ready, and therefore would not be included. And grain that's detached from the ground is not included in the sale, and that's even if it requires the ground. It's drying out there in the ground, and being there on the ground is beneficial for the grain, so it could dry out better. Something about being on the ground there, the ground absorbing some of the moisture or giving off some good air that's beneficial for the grain. Nevertheless, even though it's good for it to be there, nevertheless that's not considered dependent on or connected to the ground and is not included in the sale. And it does not include an area of reeds that is the size of a bet roba. And the chidush here is that even though they're thin, and you might say, well, they're not so significant because I know it takes up this size of area, but each of the reeds are pretty thin. Doesn't matter. We don't go by whether they're thick or thin. Individually, we look at the entire area. How much is it? And if it's a bedrova, then that's considered its own area and is not included in the sale, even if you say everything in the field is not even in the field. Amar Rabbi Chiya bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan lo chisata kani bilbad ela afilu aruga ketana shel besamim veyesh la Hashem b'fei asma ena nimkeret imaha. Rabbi Chiya bar Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, not only a cluster of reeds, but even anything else like a garden of spices, that would be much smaller. You don't grow that much spices. Even a little bit of spices goes a long way. As long as it has its own name, and you say, oh, this is an area, this is a garden of this type of spice, of allspice. So then that's going to be important in of itself. This is an area of mint. So that's important in and of itself, and is not considered part of the field and is not sold with it. For example, for example, you call this area the roses of Mr. So-and-so. So it has its own name, it's identifiable. If it's identifiable, it's not included in the sale, even if you say the field and everything in it. And it also does not include a watch station that's plastered with clay. That's a significant item in and of itself. And even if it's connected to the ground, so you might think, oh look, it's attached to the ground, that means it's part of the ground and sold with it? No, because it's plastered with clay, it's its own entity. And it does not include a carob tree that was grafted or a sycamore tree that was cut, even if, and the chidush here is even if it's small. Let's say it grew relatively small, but nevertheless, it's ready. It's at that stage that it could be grafted, or branches can be cut from it. Then that's considered its own entity and significant in and of itself, and it needs its own sale and is not automatically included in the sale of the field, even if you say everything that's in it. Since we mentioned this guard tower and what it's made out of, we're going to ask some related questions about selling a house and what might be included in that sale. A door frame. What is a halacha? If I sell you a house, so certainly the wall of the house made out of stones, that's included, that's part of the house. But what if I put a frame around the door, wooden frame? Is that also included automatically? So the answer is if it's attached with clay, with cement, then don't ask the question. Certainly, that's physically tightly attached to the door, to the frame, to the doorway, and therefore it's certainly part of the house. But what if it's only connected with pegs, like in this picture? So that's not really permanently attached to the house. It's just with pegs. It's kind of temporary. That is the question that he asked, and we leave that unresolved. Another question. What about window frames? You have to remember in those days, they didn't actually have windows, meaning they had no glass. Glass was invented, but that would be like for very, very expensive plates or something like that. But when we say windows, we just mean a hole in the wall. So if you have a frame, a window frame made out of wood, is that included? It's just like for decoration. Do you say that this is just an ornament for decoration? It's like putting up a painting. So that's not considered part of the house and is not included. Or if it's attached to the house, so then it's part of the house. Teko, we leave that unresolved. Mahu kol echad mitaltele behadar tiba elach ta mitaltele ki tiba elach echad ela mitaltele mai teko. Rabbi Yirmiyah asked a question. What about the stands for the legs of a bed? You have the leg of a bed, and then you have like a coaster or an item that goes on the bottom of it to protect the bottom of that leg. Is that, if I sell you a bed, are those coasters included or not? So, well, it depends. If they move along with it, they're basically kind of attached to it, then that's not a question. Certainly, that's part of the bed because it moves around with it. But the question is if it doesn't, if it's not attached, and when you pick up the bed, those don't come with it. So that's where we ask the question: is it still considered part of it because it's always resting on that and kind of is necessary to protect the bottom, to protect the floor, to protect the bottom of the leg, or since it's not attached and it doesn't move with it, so it's not considered attached, we leave that unresolved as well. We mentioned that the carob tree that has been grafted, or the sycamore tree that you did cut down in order to use its wood, that's already at a late stage, and it's considered its own separate entity. It's not included in the sale of a field. What's the source? We can learn it from the pasuk that says that the field of Ephron that was in Machpelah, in front of Mamre, the field, and the continuation of the pasuk says the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field, that were in the boundaries around, were established for Avraham as a possession. So he gets everything he gets the field, and that means also the boundaries of the field, the boundary markers, anything that's around there, that's included in the field as well. So what can we learn from this pasuk? That anything that requires a boundary around it, in other words, it's not significant in and of itself. If you want to say, oh, this is included in the field, so you have to say, oh, it's within this boundary. Well, then anything that's within that boundary will be included. But that will exclude trees like these, like a grown carob tree or sycamore tree that you already are using and grafting and cutting down. Those, you don't require a boundary around them because they are identifiable individually. Say that sycamore tree, oh, that significant tree, right? So it's identifiable in and of itself. Whereas if it's a small tree, then you generally would identify it as things that are within these boundary markers. So we can see from this pasuk that it says he gets the trees that are within the boundary. So anything within the boundary, because you need the boundary marker to know what's in it, and these trees are not significant in and of themselves. So those small trees, young trees, are included in the sale of a field. But if it's a significant in and of itself, and that's the definition of significant, then it's not included automatically in the sale. Mishashia says we can learn from here that boundaries are part of a Torah law, meaning that when I sell you a field, then the boundary markers, the boundary markers themselves, which might be made out of bushes or whatever, they are considered part of the sale, because you see from this pasuk that he sold them the field and the boundaries also. So all that's part of the sale. Amar Rav Yehuda, Hayman de Mizaben ad al lechabre, sarich lemichtav le, kani lach diklin v'talin v'husin v'sisin. V'afagav de chi la katav le hachi kaneh, v'afilu hachi shufra dishtarahu. Rav Yehuda says, if someone is selling a field to someone else, he should write in the deed that I am selling this field along with the palm trees, the dates, the branches, and the seedlings. It's appropriate to write all that. Now, even though if you don't write it, all those things are still sold, right? Because we said only if it's a major, big carob tree or big sycamore tree, those are independent things that are not included in the sale. But any of these things are small and will be included in the sale. So you don't actually have to write this. So why does he say that you should write it? Because this is an enhancement of the document. The more details you put in a document, the better it is. It doesn't leave room for disagreement. It's much clearer. So you should always write all these things. The halachot that we're talking about is only when it's ambiguous. You didn't say, okay, we have to assume that you did mean the permanent things, but not the movable things. We have to figure it out. But it's best to write it out, and that makes the document more beautiful, more usable, and better overall. Let's say I say, I'm going to sell you land and palm trees. So we see, if I own palm trees, I have to give you palm trees. Now I said plural, But so how many? Let's say I have 10 palm trees. Well, I only said palm trees plural. I didn't say all 10. So that means I have to give you 2 because the minimum of plural is 2. Now, if I don't own palm trees, but I said I'm going to sell you land and palm trees, I have to go buy palm trees because I said I'm going to sell to you. So I have to buy 2 palm trees. Again, the minimum of plural is 2. If I do own palm trees, but they're mortgaged out, there's a lien on them, then I have to redeem 2 palm trees and give them to you because I said that I'm going to give you land and palm trees. Now let's say I say it a little differently. Let's say I say I'm going to give you land with palm trees instead of and with palm trees. So if I'm giving you the land and we look, if there aren't palm trees on the land, then the palm trees are included in the sale. And if there are no palm trees, then it's a mistaken transaction. I promised you land with palm trees, but the land that I have doesn't have any palm trees. So therefore, I promised you something that I don't even own. So therefore, the whole sale is canceled. A different formulation, if I say I'm going to sell you land of palm trees, and so certainly fast palm trees, then that goes along. If it has no palm trees, then we don't say the sale is canceled, because what you could mean by a land of palm trees is a land that is worthy, that's fit to have palm trees. Palm trees would grow well here, and so therefore the land does go through, and I don't have to provide any palm trees. Amale leba medikla pelanya hazenan idikla tabahu shiure shayire idikla bishahu kol sheken hanach. If I say I'm selling you this land, except for that particular palm tree, I specify one of them. So then what happens? We see if that palm tree that I specified is a good one, so then I keep that good palm tree for myself. That makes sense because it's a really good palm tree. I would want to keep it for myself, and everything else on the field goes. However, if the one that I specified is a bad palm tree, then I keep for myself not only that bad palm tree, but all the good palm trees also, because all the more so, if I even want to keep for myself the bad palm tree, then kol sheken, I want to retain myself the higher quality palm trees, so therefore I keep all of those. Amar le bar me'ilane, i'it le ilane, le bar me'ilane. If I sell you a field and I say I'm giving you the field except for the trees. Now, if there are trees, then you get the field and I keep the trees. That's a simple case. But we're going to have a more complicated case. Let's say there's no regular trees on it, but there are palm trees on the field. So then when I said trees is a more general term, and so I must have meant the palm trees, and therefore you get the field and I keep the palm trees. If there are only grapevines on the field, well, grapevines also as a type of tree, and therefore I must be referring to the grapevines, and therefore you get the land and I keep the grapevines. Okay, those are simple cases when there's only one type of tree there. But let's say there's 2 types. Ilaneh v'gufneh lebar me'ilaneh. I sell you a field and I say, I take the field except for the trees. But there are regular trees and grapevines. Well, then we use the more specific meaning of trees. That's the regular trees. So I keep the regular trees, but I didn't specify the vineyard, the vines, and therefore the buyer gets the vines. The idea is that I said if I wanted to keep the vines, I would have had to say except for the vines, because there are both regular trees and vines, and I only said the word trees only holds back from the sale the regular trees, the vines go through with the sale. And similarly, if there are regular trees and palm trees, and I said I'm selling you the field except for the trees, that refers only to the regular trees, but so that I keep the regular trees, but the palm trees go to the buyer. Now here's the more complicated case. If there are vines and palm trees, so I said take the field, I'm selling you the field except for the trees. I just said ilaneh, generic. So which one does that refer to? So am I keeping for myself the grapevines or the palms? The answer is I keep for myself the grapevines, which are more expensive and more valuable. So therefore we assume that, well, neither of them are both of them are within the general category of trees, but it's not clear which one is I am referring to. So we assume that the seller wants to keep for himself the grapevines and sell the palm trees. Amar Rav, kol she'olin lo bechevel haveh shiur, kol she'en lo bechevel la haveh shiur. If I say I'm selling you the field and I'm keeping the trees, so not all the trees do I keep, only the big ones, but the small ones are not significant yet, and therefore go along with the sale. Now, how big does it have to be significant? So anything that I need a rope to climb up, that's big, and that I'm retaining for myself. But if it's a small tree that you don't need a rope to climb up it, then that's not retained by the seller. That goes to the buyer. Or another definition, that was the definition said by Rav. V'dayane gola amri, judges of exile who are identified as Shemuel and Karna. They say, Kol sha'ol kobsho lahaveh shiur, Kol she'en ha'ol kobsho haveh shiur. If when you're plowing that area and the yoke of the ox bends the tree back, so that means it's a pretty small tree that just plowing the ground near it will move the tree. In that case, that's not held back. That's just a small little tree, and that goes along with the sale. But if it's big and strong enough that the plow will not bend back the tree, will not move it, then that is considered left out, and I keep that because I said I want to keep the trees, so I keep the big trees that are more stable. Now, these are two different definitions. So which one is it? Actually, they're not in controversy with each other. If you're talking about palm trees, that's what Rav was talking about. Palm trees grow nice and tall. So if they're so tall that you need a rope, that's considered significant, and the seller kept them for himself. Whereas the Dayane Gola, their definition is talking about other regular trees, which don't grow as tall as palm trees. And so for there, you want it to be about the stability of the tree. And if it doesn't bend back when the plow goes over it, then that's considered strong enough. That it's its own entity, and the seller keeps the tree when he says, I'm selling you the field, but I'm keeping the trees. That's already a tree that's significant enough that the seller would keep. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.